Hello. My thesis is titled The Validity of Literary Representations of Epidemic Illness in the 20th Century. It is no question that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the lives of everyone across the globe, and one of the biggest questions is how this will affect our future. While most of the academic research currently and in the coming years will be concerned with the scientifics of the virus, a global event like this will make a lasting impression on the media produced as well. This media includes future literature with the COVID-19 virus functioning as a literary device. The looming question is, how will COVID-19 be represented? Diseases have been the companions of humans for centuries and have been featured in literature by such authors as Shakespeare and Chaucer. Still more recently, and most similar to our current situation, is the influenza epidemic of 1918. As the most recent global pandemic, this era of literature gives us the best insight as to how literature changes in response to widespread epidemic illness. This period of time is called the modern era and stretches from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, and includes many other historic world events which also contribute to the representation of illness. From this time period, I will be examining in depth three texts: Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, Catherine Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and Albert Camus' The Plague, providing a timeline of how epidemic illness has been represented before, during, and after the influenza epidemic. To begin, it is important to address the theoretical work of Susan Sontag in relation to my thesis. In her essay, Illness as Metaphor, Sontag discusses the representation of tuberculosis in cancer, arguing that the demonization of cancer, in contrast with the romanticization of tuberculosis in literature, is unethical, as it negatively affects real people suffering from cancer. Sontag applies this argument further and argues that illness in general should not be used in literature as a device, as it could have negative ramifications. Additionally, Sontag claims that epidemic illnesses don't work as literary devices because they are easily demystified over time. However, this assessment is narrow and doesn't consider the importance of representing illness and disease in literature. The texts that I'm examining each represent illness through a different lens that demonstrates the value and significance of using illness as a literary device. Firstly, Death in Venice by Thomas Mann was written before the influenza epidemic and draws most influence from what was largely popular in literature during this time, mythology. Friedrich Nietzsche especially outlined the dichotomy between the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus, spawning distinct ideologies connected with each of them. The Apollonian promotes logic, rationality, and purity, while the Dionysian represents chaos, irrational emotional thought, and endless intoxication. However, Nietzsche advances the idea that both of these converging ideologies must remain balanced to maintain this dichotomy. For the main character of the novel, Aschenbach, the conflict between Apollonian and Dionysian values dominates his thoughts, as he obsesses over the young boy Tadzio, the perfect representation of Apollonian idealism. Aschenbach believes to be looking at a younger version of himself, yet refuses to acknowledge how the Dionysian has started to influence him and his actions. The disease in this novella appears in the form of cholera, silently sweeping through Venice and ultimately killing Aschenbach when he refuses to heed the warnings of infection throughout the city. While refusing to leave, Aschenbach also actively chooses to not inform Tadzio and his family about the disease, and takes a sick pleasure in knowing that they might all get infected. As the crux of this novella, illness functions as a way to demonstrate Aschenbach's lengthy descent from his extreme Apollonian ideals into the extreme chaos of the Dionysian. This descent is characterized by how excessively Aschenbach has lived. His excessive dedication to Apollo has left Aschenbach unbalanced, as the dichotomy fails when the Apollonian and Dionysian ideals are not in equilibrium. The next text is Catherine Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which takes place at the overlapping of the influenza epidemic and World War I. The near-death experience of the main character Miranda is actually based upon a similar experience that Porter had. However, Porter wrote this novella 20 years after the fact. While Mann took a mythological approach to illness, Porter's novella takes a psychological framework to facilitate its narrative. Freud and Porter were contemporaries, and a large portion of Pale Horse, Pale Rider concerns how Miranda deals with the virus in her mind. The time between Porter's near-death experience and when this novella was written gives the text an aspect of traumatic memory, while at the same time allows the reader to empathize with this trauma. In Illness as Metaphor, Susan Sontag remarks upon the historical amnesia that has surrounded the influenza epidemic. She explicitly says, quote, "Diseases understood to be simply epidemic have become less useful as metaphors, as evidenced by the near-total historical amnesia about the influenza pandemic of 1918-19, in which more people died than in the 4 years of World War I." End quote. Pale Horse, Pale Rider addresses part of this observable amnesia. With how large-scale and unique World War I was at the time, the epidemic was largely ignored in history. Porter's novella is one of the very few examples we have of a first-hand personal experience with this new outbreak, which is why this illness represented in literature is so important. Pale Horse, Pale Rider interconnects the war and the epidemic in Miranda's mind, which gives the epidemic the same historic weight that was given to World War I. This interconnection allows people to remember how devastating the epidemic really was, and gives people the chance to connect with a time that otherwise would have been entirely forgotten. Moving forward, Albert Camus' The Plague takes place in the 1940s, and as such is heavily influenced by World War II. This novel is centered around the town of Oran, and their experience when the bubonic plague appears and they are forced into a city-wide quarantine. The plague in this novel is linked with France's experience during World War II. The death and despair caused by the virus functions as a metaphor for the horror of the Nazi invasion during World War II, and a narrative of existentialism appears because of this. Under this framework of existentialism, the main character, Dr. Rieux, struggles with the question of whether to admit defeat to the virus or fight back against it. As one of the primary doctors for the town, Rieux's life is pulled apart as he must constantly aid patients and watch the townspeople around him suffer and die. Rieux ultimately chooses to fight back against the plague, yet, faced with all of the suffering around him, Rieux struggles to believe that his fight is making a difference. This despair and existentialism caused by the invasion of the plague is the central conflict driving this novel. Alongside this existentialism is the loneliness that occurs on the part of the town as they are completely cut off from the outside world, though they are sharing this experience together. The plague binds the townspeople together in a shared experience of suffering. Rieux's struggle is projected on the town, as the question arises of how humans in a community will respond to a period of immense suffering. Rieux believes that suffering often leads to the development of greatness, yet he maintains that suffering simply to produce greatness is immoral. The key point here, though, is that this plague becomes utterly communal in Rieux's perspective as the narrator. The townspeople are all sharing the plague together, as they are unable to individualize their experience. Out of the three, this novel is the most directly concerned with metaphorizing an illness to represent a significant world event. The consequences of World War II were immense and changed the course of the second half of the century. For the plague to be metaphorized to represent the Nazi invasion is crucial in understanding how literary representations of illness function. At the basic level, viral illnesses have the ability to mutate and therefore grow continually within our society. Advances in modern medicine have been able to slow this process, and many deadly viral diseases, such as polio and even bubonic plague, have been largely eradicated across most of the globe. Yet, they still persist, and new viruses appear worldwide. Part of the fear and existentialism that Dr. Ryu feels comes from the unignorable fact that the plague can never be fully eliminated. At the end of the novel, when the plague comes to an end in the town of Oran, Ryu displays this fear. Quote, "He knew that this happy crowd was unaware of something that one can read in books, which is that the plague bacillus never dies or vanishes entirely, that it can remain dormant for dozens of years in furniture or clothing, that it waits patiently in bedrooms, cellars, trunks, handkerchiefs, and old papers, and that perhaps the day will come when, for the instruction or misfortune of mankind, the plague will rouse its rats and send them to die in some well-contented city." End quote. This passage demonstrates that, like the plague, the political ideals of the Nazi Party has not been fully eliminated, though they have been defeated for now, and warns of a time when they could return. This novel asks the reader to remember the horrifying cost of allowing such political ideals to return, and reminds them to fight back against them when they do. And it does this under the metaphor of the plague. Looking forward, the COVID-19 pandemic represents a new time for our society. It is the first global pandemic in 100 years, and without fail, it will characterize the decades of the 2020s. There are many different directions that literature could take in representing this illness, and each of them would serve as a way to remember this global experience. World events that have happened and will happen in the near future could serve as the basis for this representation, as the responses to the pandemic have varied widely by country. Additionally, the 21st century has expanded the globalization of media substantially, and the prevalence of social media has the ability to play a large role in the future. In whatever way this pandemic is portrayed in literature, it is important that it will be portrayed. As we see with Pale Horse, Pale Rider, worldwide pandemics and their devastating effects can be easily forgotten. Yet in literature, these events can be memorialized. Also of note is that epidemic illnesses always have an essential aspect of community associated with them. Illnesses as a literary device work well because of the communal nature of its spread. As globalization continues and our communities get larger, representations in literature of our current state will define how future generations see us. Using epidemic illness and this current pandemic as a literary tool has immense value in demonstrating this crucial moment in world history.